if I don't use the microphone? Or would you rather I use the microphone?
How do you sound with it?
Sorry?
How do you sound with it?
This is me with the microphone.
That's better.
That's better. Okay. It just makes me feel a little bit like a stand-up comedian.
Better be funny.
Another job?
Huh?
Another job?
Well. There's, as David said, I've had lots of thoughts about what I should be saying tonight. Bill Riddle suggested that I should speak on whether the Ewings are a clan or not. But since getting here, that's something that I haven't heard anyone talking about. So it kind of maybe will come, well, it certainly will come into what I'm talking about, but it's not going to be the main thrust of what I'm talking about. Because, you know, if I were to pursue that, I'd be exploring what exactly a clan meant historically and what it means today in Scotland. Because if we were a clan, it would be a Scottish clan. That would be where it would have some significance, I think. I mean, obviously, any group of people can call themselves a clan, but I think the inference was in Bill's question is are we a Scottish clan? To which the answer is actually very complex, but it's kind of yes and kind of no. But I thought I'd maybe talk a bit about the early history of the Ewings, as I understand it, and start with a tradition that's recorded in E.W.R. Ewing's book, which is from, and I can't remember exactly where this group of Ewings were that met regularly, that he mentions in his book, and I don't know if it might even be the ones that you know, who record a tradition that he obviously asked them, what do you think the origin of the Ewings was? And they said that the Ewings had been the chiefs of a Highland clan, and that their leader had been executed by the king and his sons had fled to Ireland. And of course, I kind of thought, well, you know, everyone wants to think they're the chief, don't they? And whenever people are reincarnated, then in their last life they were usually, well, the women were Cleopatra and the men were Julius Caesar. And so I more or less dismissed that without thinking about it. And I now think that I was completely wrong to dismiss that, because I think that there is good evidence which says that the Ewings, and if you're in the closely related group of Ewings, that those are the Ewings that we're talking about. The Ewings were actually chiefs, and obviously some of them might have been at the period that they went to Ireland, some of them might have been brothers or cousins or what have you of the chief. But still, if you trace them far enough back, it's all one family. And so my feeling is that it possibly does represent the chiefly line, and I'll tell you why that is. In the Clan McEwen records, it's a clan which has got precious little written about it, to be honest. But there's an interesting book from the turn of the last century, called Some Clan Ewan, Some Records of Its History. And in there, it said that the clan, the McEwens fought at the Battle of Langside under a new clan banner. Now, the Battle of Langside was when, that's all right, the musical accompaniment is appreciated.
Sorry.
The Battle of Langside was when Mary, Queen of Scots, had been put in prison, and the most of the Scots lords had accepted the reign of her son, the boy James VI. And she was put in prison and then she escaped. And she rallied as many people as she could. And the chief of her followers at Langside was the Earl of Argyll, the leader of the Campbells. And the chief of her opponents was the Earl of Lennox. And the Earl of Lennox was her father-in-law, because, as you may know, Mary Queen of Scots was accused of murdering her husband, or at least of being behind the plot that blew up his house in Kirk-on-the-Fields. And so he, who had been her friend, became her implacable opponent. Now, the McEwens, at the Battle of Langside, were fighting under a new clan banner, and that banner means that they must have had a new grant of arms to the chief. You don't get a new banner unless you have a new coat of arms. And the clan banner represents the arms of the chief. So that suggests that you have to look for a grant of arms to the McEwens, or Clan Ewing, in the period shortly before Langside. And there is one grant of arms which seems to fit the bill perfectly. And Langside was fought in 1568 in an armorial, which is a heraldic book of arms, dated to 1566. There's a coat of arms under the name of Ewing, which is the arms that are used by the Ewing Family Association to this day. It's sketched quite crudely in the book, but you know, there's no mistaking the arms. And so that means that very probably the chief would have been a Ewing. Now, there's more to it than that, because according to another tradition, one of Mary's banner bearers at that battle was a William Ewing. And it seems to me that it's no coincidence that stuck right on top of the chevron in the Ewing coat of arms, there is a banner. And it's the flag which is known today as the Ensign of Scotland, the Red Ensign of Scotland. And so William Ewing had the role of actually carrying that banner for Mary Queen of Scots, and that's why it would be on his shield. At the same time as this was happening, it seems the Ewings were settled on estates in Ladyton, which is in Dunbartonshire, south of Loch Lomond. And those estates can only have been available to them after 1561, because Ladyton had been the site of a nunnery. And the Scottish Reformation didn't start until 1561. So all these things, that's the grant of arms and the going to Ladyton, and also probably the elevation in Scottish society, were happening in the 1560s. So all those, I think, point to the idea that at the Battle of Langside, the McEwens were acting under a chief, and that chief was a Ewing. And there's one other strand that seems to back that up, which is that the McEwens at that time were vassals of the Earls of Lennox. Almost all of the McEwens lived on land that belonged to the Earls of Lennox. And as such, they should have been fighting at Langside under his command. But they were fighting on the other side. They were actually fighting against their feudal overlord. And for that to be the case, they must have been acting as a clan under the direction of a chief who was not a vassal of the Earl of Lennox. And the grant of land to the Ewings at Ladyton would have meant that they were no longer vassals. So as long as the chief is not a vassal, he can call out his men to fight against their own feudal overlord. And so that's, all those things seem to me to point quite clearly towards the notion that here we have a Ewing chief. And before I go slightly further back into Ewing history, I should say that the reason that I believe that's our lot of Ewings is kind of twofold. One is the tradition, which I said right at the beginning. The Ewing chief is executed and his sons flee to Ireland. And everyone here has ancestors. If you can trace your ancestry back, if you're from the closely related group, it always goes back to Ireland. I don't know, are there any Ewings here with ancestors who haven't come through Ireland?
There are a couple, but it's not clear that there wasn't back migration.
Right,
Yeah.
So are there Ewings in the closely related group who didn't come through Ireland?
That don't know themselves to have come through Ireland. Yes,
Okay.
that's right.
Right, that's interesting. So anyway, the closely related group seems to have, well, obviously it's basically one family, and the time that they would have been going to Ireland, according to the tradition, they rebelled against the king, and James Ewing was executed. E.W.R. Ewing says there was no such rebellion, it's all complete fabrication. He also says that he's written to the greatest authorities of all the realms of Britain to find out if this might be wrong. And they said, no, there was no rebellion. There was a rebellion. And it was quite an important rebellion. It was led once more by an Earl of Argyll, or I think in this case he was actually a Duke of Argyll. And it was a rebellion against the Catholic King James II. And the religious divisions in Scotland at this time were a major factor in Ewing history, as indeed in the history of everyone living in Scotland in those days. And the Ewings were very, very firmly on the Protestant side, and quite hard line from what I can make out. And so they rebelled, they took part in Argyll's rebellion against James II. And as a result of that rebellion, Argyll lost his head, and it seems James Ewing lost his head too. And I have to check that out. I have no authority for saying that other than this tradition. But having first of all written it off completely, I expect that as I intend to check that out, I'm expecting to find it's true. I'm not always right in my expectations, but we'll see on that one. Certainly there is good evidence that the Ewings were involved in rebellions against the king throughout the 17th century, which of course was in England and Scotland was a time of great political turmoil. It's the Civil War period for Britain. And the Ewings were certainly involved in that. In fact, I'll just grab something out of this case here, which it makes me feel now I've moved from being a stand-up comedian into being a magician. I'm going to open this case.